right, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Airbus 320 Tech Talk. What do all those buttons do? Thank you again so much for joining me. Topic of today's discussion is going to be the thrust levers in the A320 flight deck. So first of all, thank you so much if you are returning from about a year ago when I took my leave there. I really appreciate you coming back and tuning in and your continued interest in the channel and everything I'm doing here. So I'm looking forward to getting back into the talks, like I already told you guys previously there. But what we're going to do for today's session is I'm going to just start by sharing a couple of my observations, just my personal things to share with you guys about just a few specifics about the thrust levers in the flight deck. Then we're going to move on and talk a little bit about some of the technical breakdown as far as like what the markings are, the way that we use the thrust levers in the real world. What are some of the like I said, the specific technical things I can think to tell you about, and then we'll wrap up today's session with another Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the first slide that I've got to talk with you guys about. So let's just start by taking a look at the thrust levers themselves. Like I started to say, this is just strictly my observation, just some thoughts that I've had, as I learned the airplane. But I think for anybody, when you first poke your head up in front of the flight deck of an Airbus, I think it kind of has this kind of plasticky, lightweight, not so substantial look to all the parts that comprise the flight deck here. But the thrust levers is actually one of the ones when you finally do get the chance to get up there and get your hands on the thing for the first time, it was one of the ones that caught my attention because this is one of the parts of the flight deck anyways that feels like the most heavy duty or substantial to me. And a little bit more about what I mean by that is, I think when you look at these thrust levers for the first time, it almost looks like they could be like molded plastic. I mean, they just don't look that heavy duty to me. But like I said, when you finally get your hands on them, you get to get a feel for them. It is actually this substantial hunk of metal that they've used to machine these parts. You can really tell that and feel that when you get your hands on it, like I said, for the first time. So that's one thing that really stood out and struck me. The second thing that really stood out to me is just the when you move those thrust levers back and forth through those channels there, it's very tight, and it's like you can just tell that it's these accurately, precisely machined parts that comprise this composition of this thrust lever quadrant here. And it's a very nice, clean, easy to slide, like I said, no play, no wiggle in these thrust levers themselves, which is actually different from other airplanes that I've flown, where they do just have a little bit of slack, let's say, just the way they've machined the parts, whatever you want to chalk it up to. But the best analogy that I could think to give you guys about just the way these feel is when you get inside a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz or something, just the way that the steering feels tight, and it's just like a quality product, makes me think of a Swiss watch. Just one thing that really stood out to me, like I said, just getting the feel for these things the first couple times. It's just a nice feeling control on the airplane. So next thing to tell you guys and girls about, I'm sure that most of the people watching this channel are very aware of this, but one of the most iconic features about the Airbus is the fact that the thrust levers do not move in direct correspondence to the autothrust system. So in most other airplanes, when you have the autothrust engaged, the thrust levers have these servo motors that will actually move the physical thrust lever forward and back depending on what the engine is commanding. And this is completely the opposite in the Airbus, where when the auto thrust is engaged anyways, the thrust levers are designed to just go into their respective detents and the place that they're designed to stay in for their duration of the flight. And so you never see the thrust levers moving back and forth when the auto thrust system is engaged. And you start to learn to rely on all the indications on the EWD. It's really interesting to me that you start to notice other things, you really get tuned into the sound that the engines are making, just so you have this idea in your head about what the airplane is trying to do with the thrust anyways. And like I said, that's one of my favorite things about the last airplane that I flew. And actually, like I said, a lot of planes are designed this way. When those thrust levers have those servos and they're trying to move on their own, when you're flying something like a windy approach or something like that, it's one more tactile connection that I feel like you have to the airplane, to just, it's communicating with you what it's trying to do. So when you feel those thrust levers trying to move in a certain direction, you actually get an idea for what's the wind doing outside the airplane, how's the energy state of the airplane behaving. It's something you lose when you have a system like this. So don't get me wrong, it works. You get used to it. It's fine after like I said, you warm up to it a little bit. But if I had the choice, if somebody was to say to me, you could either have like this style that exists on something like a Boeing, or the Embraer was the last airplane that I flew, the 175 anyways, I think I would go and like to have that servo feedback or that movement in the thrust levers. But like I said, it's just something you get used to after flying the thing for a good amount of time. So the next thing we're going to talk about is just some of the markings on the thrust levers themselves. So I pulled a graphic just right out of one of our training manuals. So hopefully this isn't too confusing to look at. What I want to go over here is just, like I said, the markings as we move up and down the whole thrust lever quadrant. And all that this is right here is just kind of like a side view of what each thrust lever angle position and what range will yield you as far as like the different thrusting options that we have available to us. So it's like, when we're sitting in the flight deck, just think of it like a top-down view of just this, but it's very intuitive. And this might be a little confusing for some of you guys to look at for the first time, but just to make heads or tails of that. So let's start off and talk about these paint markings here. So essentially we have a mirror image on both sides of the thrust lever quadrant there. Now this is pretty obvious as to why this is. Probably, the first officer sitting on the right-hand side and the captain sitting on the left-hand side. You may have these instances where, depending on where the thrust levers are at, you couldn't read the paint on the other side of the thrust lever quadrant. So you would always obviously just want to be able to look down and know exactly where your thrust levers are positioned for obvious reasons. So that's just, if you're wondering why that is the case, that's the explanation there. One thing also that I want to share with you guys too is these tick marks here are very interesting. And this is a funny story to me. I'd been in the plane for a couple of years, and I talked to like every line captain that I flew with that had been in the airplane for a long time. And I was always like really curious, like, can somebody explain to me like why these are here, what they're there for, what do we use these for? And nobody ever knew, like right off the top of their head. And it's interesting. There is no flying procedures that I could find in any of the manuals. And I've asked like some of our like, high up, like top, most experienced Airbus people in our training department here. And they concur that there is no times necessarily when we're actually flying the airplane that you're actually paying reference to these little tick marks here. The best thing that I was told is they're actually for engineering reasons or maintenance reasons, perhaps. If the maintenance folks are trying to calibrate an engine or something like that, or do some sort of task like that. That's what I was told these tick marks are there for. So that's the best thing that I can tell you guys. But it's funny. I challenge you, if you know any other Airbus people, like go out there and try to ask them the same question. I'd be surprised if anybody could just rattle off a correct answer to you. So, and by all means, if anybody out there knows more specifics about that one, I would like to learn about that myself as well. But let's forget about that because we don't really use that when we're flying the airplane. So let's talk specifically about all these different positions and the markings on the side of the thrust levers here. So let's just begin talking about where the thrust levers are normally living, when you're at the gate or the engines are shut down, or even when you're idling the airplane. They're at the 0 position here. Now, let's say you wanted to bring the thrust levers into the reverse position. So let's just start, going rearward. The first thing that you're going to have to do if you want to engage reverse thrust in the airplane is you're actually going to have to make a really definitive movement. So you have to like reach up and over the thrust levers themselves, and you got to pull these latches. These are these right here. There's these little mechanical locks that will unlock these linkage and these little gates like inside the thrust lever quadrant, and that will actually allow you to bring the thrust into the reverse position. And if you think about how important this is and why it's important, with a 2-engine aircraft or most aircraft, the way they're designed these days, you would never want to be able to inadvertently bring the engines into reverse thrust while you're flying. So that's why they've designed in this like really substantial action that's required of you if you're desiring to bring the thrust levers back and go into reverse thrust. And really small little interesting side note here is, if you look back in history, there have been some airplanes that have come along various points in time where you could actually engage the thrust reverse when you're flying around. I know that the DC-8, I'm pretty sure you could deploy the inboard engines thrust levers if you wanted to when you're flying. I want to say there might have been another McDonnell Douglas product where you could do that same thing, but kind of a funny thing to contemplate in this day and age. You never see this designed into airplanes anymore. So just like I said, one little bonus thing there to share with you guys. But Back to our Airbus, if you want to go into reverse thrust, you reach up, you unlock those locks there, and you are allowed to bring the engines into the reverse regime here. So one other interesting thing I can think to tell you guys about this is the fact that if you are desiring to bring the engines into reverse thrust, most of the time when we're using these in the real world, you're never going to use a setting that's between like the idle reverse and the full reverse setting. You pretty much just go all the way back to the full rear or full reverse thrust setting if you're ever planning on using the reverse thrust. And I can't remember a single time ever where we've intentionally used like a mid setting in the reverse regime there. It's just something we never really do, interestingly enough. So just like I said, a little side comment there for you. And one other like really gee whiz thing that I would like to be able to tell you guys, and I don't know off the top of my head, but when you bring those engines back into full reverse, the engines themselves, they're not actually going to go like all the way to like the max like RPM setting that as they would when you're in like a full thrust, like going forward sort of setting. And I don't know, like I said, what that number is, but it is some sort of partial capabilities, let's say, of how high the engines are allowed to like re-spool up once you get those thrust reversers out and you start deflecting the air forward to slow your airplane down. So just something to share with you there. So when you're done using the reverse thrust, though, it's pretty easy to stow the reversers themselves. All you really do is you just slide the thrust levers back towards the idle point. And it's interesting when you're ready to actually close those doors up on the engines. And by the way, for those of you, once again, most of the people watching the channel, you're probably aware of what those the cascades or like the translating sleeve on the engine looks like. That's all of what I'm talking about here when we're going into reverse thrust. If you've ever been a passenger on an airplane, you look out the window and you're wondering like what all that opening up is going on the engines when you land. You feel the reverse thrust kicking in. These thrust levers here are actually what we're manipulating when we're getting that to happen. So if you had any question about that, that's just a point of clarification there. But like I started to say, it's really quick and simple. Just to slide the thrust levers back up past that gate, and it's really definitive. You really feel it. You hear this like click click, and it's just like this like I said, this solid feel in the thrust lever quadrant. You can tell where you've got the thrust past the reverse setting, and now you're back in the normal regime. And it's interesting because you slide the thrust levers up just past that point, then you bring them back, and you're locked out again. So if you wanted to like re-reverse the thrust levers for any reason, you have to reopen up those triggers again. And it's something we rarely, if ever, typically would need to do, but just I just want you guys to have an understanding of how the system works. So that's a whole lot of detail about reverse thrust, probably way more than you wanted to know. Let's talk about the forward thrust positions here. So we have this range from 0 or idle up to the CL. CL stands for climb detent or climb power. The next detent up from there is the flex or the MCT or the max continuous thrust setting. And then on the top, we have the takeoff and the go around setting. And something to mention, that word that I use there, the detents, there's actually these like mechanical, like stopping points, if you will, that they're kind of like these soft, like, I don't know, they're these points in the thrust lever movement where you have this definitive like feel that the thrust lever takes a pause here, and you actually have to, you slide up into it, you feel the detent. If you want to go past that, you have to add like more more force with your hands than what you were doing previously. So you've got to make a little bit of an effort to go past the detent. So it's just, they've designed this very definitive feel to it to let you know when you're in those detents. And it's pretty nice. Like after you've, when you're conducting a takeoff, for example, you're not looking down like at the thrust levers. You're just feeling with your hands and where those detent positions are to let you know when you're in the right spot with your thrust levers. And of course, the non-flying pilot is backing you up. He's kind of reading some indications to you off the EWD there. So if you're wondering about what it feels like, that's a little bit of explanation with that. Now, normally when we're doing most stuff with the airplane, so just actually let me, let's walk through like a normal flight. Let's say we're going to conduct a takeoff. Most days we're doing a flex takeoff, and if you're not familiar with that term, it just means like a reduced thrust takeoff. So whole lot of detail, we can go into that one, but it's basically just like, using a less than max output thrust setting because we've got way more power than we need to most days just to save engine life. So we're just using like a lower than like I said, the max output that the power can give us for a takeoff. Like I said, you go up to the flex MCT position, you conduct your takeoff. When you get to 1,000 feet, typically you just bring the thrust levers back one click into the climb detent, and that's where they stay for the complete remainder of the flight, typically, if you're going to use the auto thrust throughout the whole flight. And usually, you really don't bring them back out of the climb detent until you're ready to bring the engines to idle on the landing roll. So it kind of circles back and connects with what I told you about initially, where the thrust levers never move physically without those servos in there. So just a little bit of like I said, some real world context there to paint on that one for you guys. So and just also too, I figured just to give you a little bit of explanation, I kind of started down this track talking about it, but we have these 3 different settings for a reason, and for the most part, it is for engine wear, is my understanding. So normally with most things we're doing in the airplane, like the climb setting is more than adequate. And what these all specifically mean is there's these different, like there's a different N or fan rotation speed, and there's different it gets pretty complex. The engine has all these parameters that it uses to draw a top line of performance that it's going to allow you to have. So the climb one's kind of like the normal operation type of thrust that we're allowed to use. The flex or the MCT, we already talked about if you're doing a takeoff, but max continuous thrust is very specifically used if you had an engine failure and you want to get, just like the name implies, let me run this engine for an indefinite period of time at the very max that you can give me. And then the takeoff and the go around setting, or the toga, is just saying to the engines, like, give me all that you've got. And here's another one of those like gee whiz things. I wish I had the number to tell you like how long you could leave the thrust levers in the toga position without damaging the engines. I think there's going to be some cueing by the airplane to tell you to bring them out of toga if it's been too long. There's certainly, you're not using toga that typically for long periods of time anyway, so it's never something we're just going to forget to do. But if you're, I don't know, in some sort of emergency scenario, I mean, we talk about using toga if you need the performance for takeoff. Obviously, if you're making a go around, or if you're trying to get out of wind shear, those are kind of like the biggest times when we're gonna need that. But like I said, it's just demanding like the absolute max power output that the engine can give you just in general. So without regard to engine wear and engine life and all this kind of stuff. And we could take it a step further and also say that those FADECs are never gonna they're not going to allow you to blow the engines up or just totally burn them up. Like in days of old, you really could like firewall a jet engine and you could destroy the thing just by where you had the thrust levers positioned for too long, let's say. But modern airplanes, the Airbus, doesn't work like that. But I just wanted you guys to have a little bit extra understanding about those 3 settings there. So just to finish all of that off, if you were wanting to disengage the auto thrust and just fly by hand, which is something we'll do occasionally if it's rare that the auto thrust system is deferred as inactive, but there are times when you're just flying a visual approach and you want to be able to like keep your feel for the airplane. So you'll kick the auto thrust off and you'll just be in charge of regulating the thrust levers by yourself. And you're allowed to, or the range of movements that you would normally be making are somewhere in between the climb detent and the idle thrust position there. So probably way more information you guys wanted to need, or you guys were needing to have. If you can think of any more questions, feel free to drop them in the comment section down below there. But let's try to move on from that. So there's one other thing that I wanted to tell you guys about. When we look up here on the EWD, if you look really closely, it's kind of hard to see in the resolution of this photograph here, but this blue donut, that is the actual thrust lever position that we've got the thrust levers, that they're living in at this point in time. So when I took this photo, we were up at cruise altitude, and just like I had mentioned before, the thrust levers have just stayed in the climb detent. They haven't been moved since we made our thrust reduction after takeoff. And the blue donuts depict that. It's showing that it's in the climb detent, but the engine thrust itself is corresponding to a thrust setting that's actually back behind where the physical resting position are those or the thrust lever angles where they're at this specific moment in time. And this is also another tie-in to what I told you guys earlier in the video, where thrust levers don't move, but the engines are certainly moving back and doing all sorts of stuff depending on what sort of power output is needed for any given situation of flight that you might be in. So the really funny one to tell you guys about here is there's no quicker way to show your flying partner that you're a rookie, novice, like a new Airbus driver. And I think we all make this mistake when we first get in the thing, like the first couple times. But there's a technique when you're going to disengage the auto thrust. They teach us to match and smash. And what that means is before you disengage the auto thrust, you're actually going to move the thrust levers. So you're going to put this blue donut on top of where the engine thrust is currently sitting. So you're going to slide it out of climb detent. You're going to look up on the EWD here, and you're going to, like I said, try to match the thrust lever angle to the actual thrust output of the engine. And the reason why I say this is funny because a lot of guys and girls, when they first start to fly the airplane, they use the thrust lever disconnect buttons, which by the way, we'll take a look at that actually real quick. That's the big red buttons here. If you want to disengage the auto thrust, you just click those buttons there. But cut to the chase here. If you were to hit those red kick the auto thrust buttons off, like I said, and you didn't match and smash, the engines are going to spool up like crazy and try to get up to the thrust lever angle position where we've got these donuts sitting at right now. And it's really awkward. You'll feel the airplane thrust forward. It's just like, it's not an efficient way to fly it. And like I said, it's just like the quickest way to show your flying partner that you're a rookie. And it's a little embarrassing, but you learn really quick after you make that mistake once or twice. You just kind of get used to this whole like matching and smashing business. So that's all that I wanted to share with you guys about the thrust levers. A little bit long-winded. Hopefully you've stuck with me all the way through that. But to finish up the discussion today, I got an email a long time back. This was several months ago, right before I went out on my break, from a gentleman, Jim R. So thanks, Jim, for tuning into the channel. And he wrote me a nice email. Had a lot of good questions, and I couldn't address every single one of them detail by detail, but he did ask two very good questions. I think a lot of people out there also might be able to benefit and learn from this one. But the first question that he had was basically along the lines of, and he sent me these pictures from his flight simulator that he was using at home, and he had a very astute observation, I think. So he was basically asking the question, said, when I'm either straight or level or in a climb, I've got some much more noticeable pitch up, indication on my attitude indicator here. And he had the question about when you go into a descent, like this is a good depiction here of what he sent me. And this was really his question, like, why is it that, the same sort of nose up pitch sort of number or degree, let's say, is not exactly correspondable to the descent scenario. So let's say we were trying to make a 1,000 foot per minute climb. The nose is going to be pitched like way more up, or several more degrees above the horizon. But when you go down here, you can see, I think this is a good example. He's got a 3,100 foot per minute descent rate going on, and he's only pitched down like, a degree or two. And this, Jim, just goes back to like your very basic aerodynamic stuff. If you think about what an airplane's doing just in its normal flying state, what you're doing is you're pretty much defying gravity or acting in an opposite direction with the lift that you're creating with the wing, right? So you're making all this upward force, i.e. the lift from the wings, and you're really having to override the force that gravity is exerting on you, like trying to pull the airplane back down to the earth. So you have this more substantial bite that you're having to take out of the air to create that lift to keep all that weight of the airplane up in the air. Well, in your scenario here where you're wanting to descend, you don't have to pitch way down to get Mother Earth to take over. All you've got to do really is stop creating lift, i.e. bring the angle of attack back to basically like the zero position. The airplane's actually going to start to come down pretty nicely. And to further elaborate also, if, to say that, on a normal takeoff, let's say we've got, a 12.5, 15 degree, like nose up sort of attitude. If you were to have a 12.5 degree nose down attitude, that's actually very extreme, and it would be very uncomfortable, and it would be more or less scary if you're actually flying the airplane like that. 12.5 degrees down is going to yield a very, very fast descent rate. And of course, like it's just way outside of how we're normally operating the airplane, and it's a bit much. So hopefully the explanation of the physics, Jim, I hope that answers your question. But like I said, it just has to do with gravity does its job when you want to come down. You're having to fight a whole lot of gravity when you're going up. So therefore, the difference in the pitch attitudes and the angle of attack and all that, the lift, of course, it's associated in both of those two scenarios. And he did have one more question also that's a really quick one to make mention of. But he was just wondering about the correspondence or the difference, let's say here, between this yellow tick mark, or in other words, where you're actually pointing the nose of the airplane, and the green line and the associated diamond that you have here. And he was saying, every time when I'm flying my simulator, these two indications are never or rarely, if ever, lined up. And he was just looking for some elaboration about why that is. And that's a very simple explanation, Jim. So let's just take a moment to define what both of these things are. The yellow mark that we have here is actually the physical like heading of the airplane. So where's the nose pointed at with regard to your compass rose, of course. The green line in the diamond here is actually where the airplane is tracking, right? So you might be pointed in one direction, but if we look up in the top left-hand corner here, we have this wind barb. We can see that we've got a crosswind from the left. So, think about, once again, very basic, like flying 101 stuff. If you think of it like a ship, if you're trying to cruise across a river, let's say, just go straight across the river, and the river's flowing one way, and you're going, perpendicular to that, let's say. Well, that flow of the water actually makes the resultant travel or path of travel like kind of a diagonal sort of pathway, let's say. And it's the exact same thing with the airplane in the sky, except the analogy, the airplane's like the boat, and the wind that we have here is the moving water in the river. So that's all that you're really seeing here, Jim, is that you're pointing the nose to this 273 or whatever degree heading here, but the actual physical track, or where the airplane is actually going over the ground, is actually to the right a little bit. So there is that angular difference there that's kind of funny to look at, but like I said, very basic stuff. So that's all I've got for you guys today. We'll be back soon, talk about the next segment. Hope everybody's having a wonderful day out there. We'll talk to you soon.